Morning, guys. Andrew here. I've been asked to do a quick demo on how I would make a Jetpack feature inside of Unreal Engine 5. So this isn't going to be too deep or complex. It's just more of an example of how I would set up a feature to be made, how to test it, debug it, and potentially improve it. So very quick, probably 20-minute demo at most. So this is just one of an infinite number of ways you could do a feature like this. I'm just going to do it off the top of my head how I think it would go, with the anticipation of having to change it depending on where the game goes if this were an actual production. So nothing I'm doing is permanent, set in stone. You can figure out your own ways to do it, but this is just one of those ways. I'm going to be using Unreal Engine 5, and I'm going to assume that you have a little bit of knowledge on how to use the engine, but nothing I'm doing is too crazy today. So if you're going through the videos and you see something you don't quite understand, it's all basic stuff. So we can find, we'll probably make some more tutorials in the future, but there's a lot of tutorials on YouTube you can find about things like this. So don't worry about it. It's very basic. So the first thing I did was I started a new third-person project by clicking launch here on my 5.1 editor. I already did this so that it didn't have to go through the compile phase and waste anybody's time, but this is what I'm starting with. So you see here, I've got my third-person template project. It's got everything that I need, a character to run around with, everything for the inputs is set up. It's got some animations that we're going to use and adjust. So this is a perfect starting point for what I'm trying to do. One of the things I like to do whenever I'm starting a new project, though, is if you notice here, my frame rate, I'm at 90, 80 to 90. You can show your frame rate by clicking these three lines and show FPS. So I'm going to turn off Lumen. I've got a decent machine, but even in an empty gym like this, it's kind of heavy. So I like having as many frames as possible, nice and smooth, and nothing we're doing needs Lumen active right now. So to do this, you just go into the project settings, scroll down to rendering, and under global illumination and reflections, I'm going to put none. Click lumen and go to the none dropdown. And now when I go back to my view, I'm at 120, 110, 120. So it's noticeable. So this is what I like to do first thing. And if you've got a VR headset, you can disable those plugins, but everything else is good to go. So I'm just going to show you some of the assets that this project comes with. If I click Control and Space, I open up my content drawer, which is the content browser of UE4. They've added the drawer functionality so I can actually open and close it wherever I am. It's very nice. So I'm going to go into my third-person character. This is the blueprint of the character we're going to be adding to. I'm not going to be changing any of the foundation of it. I'm just going to be adding a Jetpack function to it. So if I go into my third-person map and click play, this is what we start off with. So again, I haven't built anything yet. This is the default third-person project. If you're curious on how this is set up, I would recommend you go in and break things. It's a great starting path. And if you go, I think we can add it to the link, but there's a YouTube series on how they go from nothing to this project that Epic gave out on YouTube. So you can follow that series to get here, and then you can add on to that series by watching these videos to add your Jetpack if you want to. It's good practice. So let's get into it. So one of the first things that I started doing that I find helped a lot whenever I'm working on or building a new feature is write down the rules and the requirements in a notepad or a piece of paper in front of you. This is a good way to anticipate the things that you're going to need from the rest of your team potentially, and maybe see an issue right off the bat without having to build something beforehand. So for this feature here, this is what I've written up. So the first thing would be the rules, what needs to happen and what does happen. So in our case, if jump is pressed while airborne, we're going to activate the jetpack. We have to hold the jump button to thrust. A total of 5-second duration, and this we can adjust. And then it only refreshes when we're on the ground. So as long as I can follow these rules, I'll have exactly the feature that I'm expecting. But again, this could change as we're working on it. You never know. So don't be afraid to change what you've written here. This is just a general guideline that helps you drive the work that you're doing. In the needs department, we're going to have a animation blend space of the character flying, and I'm just going to be using the assets in this project. I'm going to change them in the editor, not a big deal. And we're prototyping right now, so even if it's not good animation, it as long as there's animation there, we'll know that the feature is working. I'm going to need a Boolean, which is a variable type, a true or false, in my character that says is Jetpack. That just tells me that I'm using my jetpack or I want to. I'm going to make a float for total duration. A float is a number. So how long can I fly for? I'll need a float that says how long I have flown for, so current duration. And then maybe a jetpack mesh if I can make something inside of the editor. So based on this, I know for a fact that I'll need at least 3 variables added to my character. So to do this, it's very easy. I'm going to go into my character blueprint like I opened up earlier. And to do that again, you just click Control Space to open up your content drawer. And in this particular project, it's under Content Third Person Blueprints. So if I open this up, on the left side of the screen here, you've got a My Blueprint tab. This is a list of all the variables and components that are available to you. This is information that you can use to drive things or save and store information and retrieve later. Under that, you've got variables. So my 3 requirements here for variables are 1 bool and 2 floats. So I'm just going to click the plus here, and you see I've got a new variable, and by default it's a Boolean. So I'm going to change the name to is Jetpack. You can put it whatever you want. It's up to you. It's your project. I'll call it is Jetpack. I'm going to add 2 more, but this time I'm going to change it from a Boolean, which is a true or false, to a float, which is a number. And then I will call this total duration. And then another plus, and you see it was by default the float because it automatically chooses the previous variable's type. So total duration, and then I'll call this current duration. Another thing I like to do whenever I create variables to keep things clean is in the details panel of that new variable. So you see when I select it, the details on the right are set to whatever this variable is. I like to add a new category. So click on default here, and I'm going to type in Jetpack. And now you see on the left side, I've got a new dropdown for Jetpack. This is a great way to keep yourself clean. Do not underestimate the importance of keeping a blueprint simple and clean like this because it can get overwhelming fast. So once that's done, I have my 3 variables. I'm going to click compile and I'm going to save. So from there, we've got my 3 here. I'll do the animation and the jetpack mesh after because those are cosmetic. We don't need these to make the feature work. So I like to build the functionality first. I don't care what the look is. Once it feels good and it behaves the way I'm expecting based on these rules, then we can start making it look like the feature that we're expecting. It also helps if you have a game in mind that you've played in the past that you can use as a point of reference, but it's not important. Just play whatever feature you're making, and it's going to feel good to you eventually if you keep trying. So before I do any of the visual stuff, like the animations and putting a jetpack on the character, I'm going to build the functionality. And in this case, that functionality is going to be inside of the character blueprint. So the character blueprint is the brains and the movement of the character. The animation blueprint, which we'll get into next, is the visual representation of what the character is doing. So you can keep the logic of a jetpack in the NMBP if you wanted to, but then you would have the character telling the animation blueprint to tell the character to tell the animation blueprint. So in this case here, it makes sense to put the logic in the character itself. So I'm going to quickly build that, and this is what it would look like in this case. So the first thing I need to do is figure out what button it's going to be. And if I go back to my rules here, jump. So if I click the jump button when I'm on the ground, it will do a jump. But if I click while I'm in the air, that's when we're going to get our jetpack functionality. So if I go into my character blueprint, you'll see here it's already got a jump action. So if anybody's used UE4, you'll notice that the input for jump here is a lot more complex than it was in Unreal 4. That's because they've updated their inputs, the way that their inputs are set up. So this is the new version. It's called, I think, an advanced or enhanced action. But we're going to be using the old way, which is a lot faster for prototyping. And eventually you can transfer all the logic over to the new input system. But for this video, to avoid making things more complicated than they need to be, I'll just be using the original version. So to do that, you click on Edit, Project Settings, and you've got your Input tab here. So this is where you can set up a bunch of inputs, button presses essentially, and what types they are. So axis or action. You'll notice here it says that everything is deprecated in here. You can still use it. Just know that if you're using this for an actual production, it's not a good idea, because deprecated means they're not supporting it anymore and they're probably going to remove it eventually. So for prototyping, I think it's fine to use, but eventually you want to look up enhanced input right here. So there's a new tab for that. But for now, we're going to go to inputs. It will be an action mapping. So an action is just a button press. And I'm going to click the plus button here, and you'll see I've got a new slot, and I'm going to call this Jetpack. Next thing I want to do is select which button triggers the jetpack. In this case here will be the spacebar, and that's all I need to do. So if I go back to my character in his event graph, which is the brain of the character, if I right click anywhere on the graph with nothing selected, I get a drop down of everything I could potentially do in this graph. So it is context sensitive, meaning I can't choose a node that is for materials, for example. But even with context sensitive on, you see there's a lot of stuff. I would recommend in your own project just going through as much of this as you can, just to kind of get a sense of the things that you could do in the event graph and construction scripts, different graph types. Just explore. But for now, I'm going to right click and type in Jetpack, and you'll notice I have action events, Jetpack. So you remember it was an input action, which is what the action event implies. And that little white square with the arrow means it's an event. So an event is a red node here that fires logic out when the specific condition is met. In this case here, because I custom made this Jetpack event, I know that when I click the spacebar, I'm going to get my event fired. So to show this, I'm going to drag off of my pressed slot. So that means when the button is pressed. And I'm going to type print here. So the print string node, I use a lot for debugging. This is a great node to let you know in game what's happening when. So in this case here, I'm going to click the print string, and I can either leave it hello, or I'm going to just type in Jetpack pressed. So try to be as obvious about what your print does, in case your blueprint for some reason has 4 or 5 print string nodes that are all running at the same time, depending on what you're trying to debug. So Jetpack pressed. If I compile and save and click play, watch what happens when I click space. See, it printed Jetpack pressed. And that only happens when I click space. So right now there's no logic about when Jetpack pressed becomes true. This was just to show you that I have my event and it fires off when I expect it to, which is spacebar pressed. The next thing I want to do is make sure that this thing only fires off if I'm in the air, because going back to my rules, if jump is pressed while airborne, activate Jetpack. So if I'm on the ground and I click jump, it's triggering. I don't want that. The next thing I need to do is drag off of pressed, type in branch to get a branch node. So this is a flow control node, which are nodes that you can use to change where that event fire goes. So it's like street, like red light, green light intersections of a street. So you can use this to direct where you want that logic to go. So you can either click and drag and type in branch, or if you hold B and left click in the graph, you'll create a branch. It's an extremely common node, so it's got its own dedicated hotkey to it. So I'm going to click my pressed, drag it into the input of my branch, and then out of my branch node and the true slot, I'm going to type my print string, and then this is where I'm going to put Jetpack pressed. So a branch node needs a true or false condition. So it can either come out the true or the false, not both at the same time. And you'll notice here, my branch node has a condition input pin, and that input pin is red. If you look over here, my Boolean is red. That means that this pin is expecting a Boolean. And again, if you mouse over it, you'll see it says condition Boolean as well. So it needs a true or false plugged in here so it knows where to go. Which means if I click my Jetpack, I need to know, am I allowed to do the Jetpack? And the logic that I need is, am I in the air or am I on the ground? Because I should only be able to Jetpack if I've already jumped once, or if I've fallen off of like a cliff, for example. Luckily, Unreal has a very handy component. Over here, you'll see under the Components tab, and components are basically building blocks of a blueprint. So in our character's case, if I go to the viewport, you'll see in the Components tab, I've got a bunch of things. I have the capsule, which is the physical space the character takes up in the game. The mesh, which is the character's body. Camera, boom, and camera. So these are components. Additionally, it's got a character move component. So this is a default component that comes with a base character inside of Unreal. And this component handles how the character moves and feels in the game world. And the fun thing about that is, because it's a component of my character, that means I have access to any information relevant to that component. So if I click and drag my character movement into the graph and release, I now have a pointer to that component. So if a node has an output on this side, it means it's giving me the information stored in that component. So for example, if I click and drag off my character movement and type in airborne or is falling, there you go, and click that, this little function here, you can tell it's a function because it has a green F for function, tells me if my character is falling or not. So luckily for me, it's also a Boolean, true or false. I am falling or I am not, and I could just plug that straight into there. So if I compile and save and go back into my game, and I jump once, nothing happens. But I'm going to click the spacebar a second time when I'm already in the air, and there you go. So now I know that if I'm in the air and I click my spacebar, that's the only time I'm technically allowed to jetpack. So perfect, we're halfway there already. The other thing I need to know though is, do I have the gas to even fly? So I had created my total duration and current duration because in my rule set here, I have a total of 5-second duration. So if I select my total duration variable here, in the details panel with this selected, you'll see at the bottom I've got my default value 5. I had actually put that in myself before, but by default a float comes in empty. So if I go to current duration, you'll see the default value is 0. So my total duration, I'm going to set that to 5. And now this, when I click and drag it into my graph and get it, remember, if the pin is on the right side, it means it's providing me the information. So in this case here, if I ever ask what this float value is, it will always give me its default value. So instead of it saying Jetpack pressed, for example, I'm just going to click and drag my output into my print string, and it will convert my float into a string, which is a word that you can read. And now if I click play and jump, you see it says 5. So I know that this is my total duration, it's 5. I'm good to go. The other thing I need though is how long have I currently been flying for? So if I click on this, you see my current duration 0 because I'm not driving this anyway. The default value is 0. As far as the game's concerned, I haven't flown yet. So if I click and drag this into my graph and get that, I can do something like this. I'm going to get the total duration and type in greater or equal. I'm going to do greater. And that's going to give me this node here. So the top input is my total duration. The bottom input is my current. And it's going to do that math. Is my first input greater than my second input? Is 5 greater than 0? It spits me out a Boolean, so a true or false. And I'm just going to plug that into my print string node and show you what that's going to give me. So if I jump and click space, true. So it's true because, let me move this character over here. My total duration is 5. My current duration is 0. I'm asking it, is my total greater than my current? And it gives me true because of course it is. But what happens if I take my current duration and I'm going to set its default value to 6, for example? Now when I click jump, it says false because total is 5, current is 6. This gives me false. So that's good logic. I can use this to drive how long I stay in the air for. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that I'm only allowed to use my jetpack if I'm in the air and I have more duration left. To do this, I can click and drag off of my original Boolean. And if you type and, you get this little comparison or this little node. And I'm going to plug that into there. What this does is it checks this and this. And if they are both true, then this is true. If neither of them are true or only one of them are true, it will always go out the false. So if I plug this into there, now you're going to see if I jump when I'm in the air, it comes a true. But if I put my current duration back to 6, only this would come false. This is true if I click jump in the air, but it's going to give me a false answer. See, I can't even go to the print string because it's always coming out the false. So the first part of my logic is done. And this was easy to do because I followed my notepad here. My jump is pressed, 5-second duration, and now let's do the hold button to thrust. So right now I can trigger a true or a false. What I need to do now is have something that happens for a duration once I've pressed my jetpack button and all of my conditions are true. One of the things I can use, and it's a very handy node called a timeline. So if I click off of my true and type in timeline, at the very bottom I have an add timeline option. So if I click this, it gives me this node here, and I'll call this jetpack thrust. So timelines are very good ways to, for a preset or infinite duration, constantly fire out of my update. So if I type print here, and I'll put this to thrusting so we can see it obviously working. And I go back into game and click jump. You see it's printing infinitely. Actually, I'm wrong. It's not infinite. If you double click on the timeline, you see the default is 5 seconds. But if you open it up and click the loop button, now it's infinite. So I'm going to go ahead and add another layer of logic to stop it. So if I'm in the air and I'm pressing my jetpack, and then for some reason I want to stop flying, I can release the jetpack and I'll stop printing this. So I'm going to take off of my released and go to stop. So timelines are very powerful. Another thing I would recommend is get used to using them. So in this case here, my true is going to play the timeline. So just go through it. When I release my jump button, it's going to stop. I'm not going to put the release through the same logic gate here because whether I'm on the ground or in the air, it doesn't matter. If I release the button, I shouldn't be doing the jetpack timeline regardless. So it's just a safety net to make sure that no matter what happens, if I'm not pressing jump, the timeline is not going. So I'm going to click play and you'll see I'm going to hold and now I'm going to release. And then after a couple of seconds, all of the print strings go away because they stay on screen for a couple of seconds. But I can also show you this visually. If you want to see something happen in a graph, you can actually debug it in real time. So I have my character down here. In my graph, if you see at the top here, you've got no debug object selected. Click that, drop down to your character there, and now you're going to see the logic happen real time. So if I go back and click jump, you see, I tapped it, it went through the press and release states. So I'm going to hold it, and if I release again, good. Now I'm going to click it when I'm in the air. And now I'm going to release it. And there we go. That logic makes sense. It's working the way I expect it to. So now we've got a press and hold and release. And during those two events, with the right condition, I'm going to be constantly outputting an event here. So the next thing I want to do is add some thrusts to my character. So as long as I'm coming out of this timeline here, I want to fly. So remember I had mentioned that the character movement component handles everything movement related. I'm going to use that. So if I click and drag this into my graph, I already know, because I've done this before, that my character movement component has a node called impulse. And I'm going to be using this for my jetpack. You notice it's in the pawn components character movement. I know where impulse is, but if you wanted to, you can try to find it yourself and go through all the different nodes here, and that will give you an idea of things that you can do with your character. So I'm going to use impulse. I'm going to put it through my update here, so it's only going to give me an impulse when I come out of my timeline. I'm going to also check velocity change. So the impulse has two ways it can handle things. It can either add velocity to the current character. So if the weight of the character versus the gravity of the map that you're in, and already how fast they're falling down or jumping up, these will all be factors if you have this unchecked. If you do velocity change, you're going to say, I don't care how heavy you are, what the gravity is, I'm going to force my velocity up, or in any other direction if you so choose. I'm going to force that velocity. So in Z, I'm just going to put a 20 for now. Compile and save. And if I click jump and hold it and release it, it works. So that's pretty good. I can move around. But so far, I can fly infinitely. So the next thing I need to do is come up with logic that would kick me out of my jetpack event. So this will be pretty easy. I'm just going to pause the video here real quick. So the next step I'm going to want to do is store how long I'm flying for, so that I can compare the current versus the total duration and kick me out of the jetpack. So one way I could do this is if I grab the current, drag it. So far I've been using the get function. I'm going to do a set this time. So a set will be, it's a way for me to tell this variable what it is. By default, this variable is whatever it is you had set in the default value. But if at any point in your blueprint or outside of the blueprint, you do a set function on that particular variable, whatever you set it to here is now the default. So it does. This is only for the start of the game or start of the level. You can change this actively throughout the blueprint, however or wherever you need to. So in my case, what I'm going to do is plug this into my update. And just to show how it works, I'm going to do another print string. But I'm going to plug my variable directly into here. So now if I compile and click jump, you'll see it says 0 the whole time because it is actually 0. But if I were to put 10 in here and jump, it says 10. The reason it worked is because when I did my first button press, current duration was technically still 0. That's why I was allowed to go through the timeline. After the timeline, it's set to 10, which now if I wanted to go back and jump again like this, I can't. So jump, press and hold. If I try to jump again, I can't go through my jetpack function anymore. So let me show the blueprint happening. So the first jump, I can go through because at that point, my current duration is still set at the default, which is 0. But once I've gone through the timeline, I set my current duration to 10, and now if I jump, I can't go through because the logic is working as intended. So for example, if I go over here and right click on a variable, or even mouse over it, you'll see current duration 10, total duration 5. If I stop and click play again and mouse over it, current duration 0. So until I've gone through this set my current duration node, this will always be 0. So this is a good way for you to understand that defaults and settings are things you have to remember and manage properly, because you can accidentally break things very easily if you're not aware of what you're doing. So now that I know I can set this here, the next thing I want to do is find a way to have this count up. So I want it to add time as long as my Jetpack thrust timeline is active. So one way you can do this is to get current duration again. So I'm asking it what it is. Click and drag off of that and type in plus. And now we've got a little add function. And I'm going to right click and type in delta time. So get world delta seconds. This is a very handy universal function that gives me a time frame between the current frame and the previous frame. This is a good way to keep things stable. So if, for example, I'm running at 120 FPS and you're playing it and you're running at 30 FPS, this will spit out a smaller number for me and a larger number for you, so that no matter what your frame rate is, this will be an accurate depiction of time passing. So we're not frame rate dependent anymore. It's good practice to get used to using this. So I'm going to click and drag this. And then if I plug that into my set function, now watch what happens. I'm counting up. So what's happening here is every time I render a frame, an event goes through this line and sets my current duration variable. So every time the line goes through here, I'm going to ask my current duration what it is. I'm going to ask the engine how much time has passed between my frame and the previous one. And I'm going to add those together and reset my current duration. So every time this is set as something, the next time an event goes through here, which is the next frame, I'm going to get the previous frame's value of my current duration and add my delta to it and keep ticking up. So this is a good way for you to see that you can actually take a variable, ask that variable what it is, and then change that variable based on that answer. So now if I click play, I can hold this and it's going to keep counting up. And then once I hit 5 seconds, again, nothing happens because I haven't built the logic yet to kick me out. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that I'm only using my timeline as long as this logic is true. So my current duration has to be less than my total. So I'm going to copy paste this and bring it over here. And I'm going to add another branch. So hold B, left click, branch. And then my total duration is bigger than my current. So as long as this is true, I can Jetpack. But if this is not true anymore, I'm going to come out of my false output. And in that case, I want to go all the way over here and stop my timeline. So you can go back. Your graphs, as long as you're putting an output into an input, you can do whatever you need to achieve the expected results. Something you can do also to clean things up is anywhere on a line, it doesn't matter if it's a white line, a green line, whatever. If you double click on there, you can add a reroute node. So this is a good way to keep your graphs clean, which is extremely important. So I'm going to add 2 there, and I'm going to draw a more obvious shape so that it would be easier to debug and also cleaner to see. So now what happens is I'm constantly adding to my current duration and constantly checking if this condition is true. The second I hit 5 on my current duration, this will no longer be true, which will put me out of the false set, and I'm going to stop my timeline. So now I'm going to see this. And there you go. So that kicked me out of the timeline. And I can never jetpack again, because the only place I'm setting my current duration is here, and I'm always adding time to it. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that it resets properly. If I go back to my rules here, so far I've got, if pressed while airborne I can fly, if I hold it I'm thrusting, a 5-second duration. Now I need to add this logic here, refuels when grounded. So again, Unreal is very powerful and user-friendly. It has an event here that I can already use. So if I right-click and type in event on landed, you'll see I've got a pre-made event. I didn't add this input anywhere. This was it came with the character component. And this here, if I type in a print string, it will trigger when I land. So you see every time I land, it says hello. So I know that this is reliable. What I'm going to do with this is, when I land, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to stop my timeline, because if I'm actually no, I'm not going to stop the timeline on land, because if I'm flying somewhere and I bounce off the ground, I don't want to stop the jet. So all I'm going to do with this is reset my current duration to 0. So I'm going to grab this, set it to 0. So now you notice I have a set variable in 2 different places in my graph. This is fine, because a variable, it's just a little pocket of information that you can store, read, and write. I guess store and write are the same thing, but it's basically, this is their intended use. Over here, whenever I'm dealing with my current duration, I'm adding to it. But when I land, I'm setting it back to 0. Over here, when I'm asking current duration, I'm checking what it currently is. So reading what it is, increasing its value, setting it back to 0. And you can do this with any number of variables. Depends on the feature that you're making. So now if I go back in and click play, I'm flying. And you notice when I hit the ground, it resets to 0. So let me just add a bit of thrust to this, because I don't like that I'm bouncing. So I'm going to stay up in the air until I can't. So it kicked me out, and when I landed, it refreshed, and now I can jetpack again. So as long as I touch the ground at one point, I'm going to be resetting my current duration back to 0, which allows me to go through the whole process of flying again. So I think that's actually the expected functionality. Everything in the rules is there. It makes sense. I could still potentially tweak how much my jetpack is. You can change the total duration. So if I go to my total duration here and set the default to 3, now it's going to kick me out after 3 seconds instead of 5. So this might be a bit more reasonable so that you don't end up flying to the moon. Maybe your character can level up as you play, and at that point you can tell your total duration to increase in value over time. You know, whatever you need to do, you can do it. So next, I'm going to show you some organization. First, I'm going to delete all of my print string nodes because we don't need those anymore. And if you right-click and type in comment, you can add a comment. Comment boxes are awesome for organization. So for example, I'll bring this over here, and I'm going to make it big enough to contain the entire Jetpack graph. Or if I were to have selected it first and just click C, I get a comment box as well. So as long as something's in a comment box, if you move the entire box, it moves the entire graph. And in the comment box, you can add a comment. So Jetpack logic. So if you're working on something and you want to make sure that if somebody else is opening your graphs after you, they have all the information you need. So you can get as detailed as you want. So I like doing stuff like this, explaining why I've done certain things. So this branch checks if I am falling and have duration left. for example. So you can change the color of a comment box. Sometimes they not easy to click. So you can change the color. So maybe you can get used to using like blue as a helpful tip. Maybe if you're working in a graph and there's a part that is not working currently and you have to go, close the project, do something else, you can make a red comment box to let you know that you have to deal with that next time you log in. Be as clean as you can. It's always better. So that's over years of messing up, I find cleanliness is probably the best thing you can learn. So now that the functionality is there, let's add some of the visuals to it. So let's put in an animation, and I think I will end up putting a Jetpack mesh there so that we can see things active and inactive. We don't have any particle effects in this project, so I'm not going to do anything fancy. It'll just be a texture swap from red to gray or whatever, just to show us that we are in fact flying. One thing I forgot to add is I need to set isJetpack to true and false. And we're going to use this in the animation blueprint. So I keep this variable inside of the character blueprint because you never know when in the future you're going to need this information. So technically this would just be a visual thing to let my animation know it should play a Jetpack animation. But maybe in the future your character, when Jetpack is active, it has to trigger a number of things in another graph. So it's good to keep this information together. So I'm just going to go to my Jetpack thrust, and I'm going to set this to true when my thrust is on. And I'm going to set it to false when my thrust is off. And I'm also going to put my branch coming out of here through this as well. So they both deactivate that and then stop the graph. So that's set to true and false when I need it to be. Everything in here is good. So let's go over to the animation blueprints and make ourselves a state where we can put whatever animations we need to represent Jetpack in there. So if I go over to my content drawer, in character, mannequins, animation, you've got two blueprints in here, Manny and Quinn. So the character in here is Quinn, the female version of the default mannequin character. The male version is Manny. So we're going to be changing the Manny animation blueprint because if you notice when I mouse over the female version, it has a parent class of Manny. So if I open up the female version, Quinn's animation blueprint, you'll see here they've left a comment box for us. So this is a child animation blueprint. So this animation blueprint here derives from the male version. So any change in the logic we do in the male version will propagate down to the female version, which is the one that we see in game. So I'm going to open up the male version and I'm going to add my logic there. So they're doing a couple of things in the animation blueprint. I'm going to walk through them real quick. We don't have to do anything with this, but I'll explain why they've done it. So it's got two events right here. You notice the red node event means something fires off and then logic happens. So on blueprint initialize animation, essentially when the blueprint is built, so at runtime when you click play, it's going to go through, get owning actor. So who owns this animation blueprint? If I go back to my character blueprint here, you'll see when I select the skeletal mesh component, in the details of that component, I have an anim class slot. So Quinn C. So anim BP Quinn. That means that the owner of the animation blueprint here is whatever skeletal mesh, whatever actor owns the skeletal mesh that I have it plugged in. So in this case here, Quinn in my third person character owns this blueprint. So the event fires, I get my owning actor, so third person character, I cast to character. So a cast node is a way for me to say I've got a vague idea of who owns me, and I'm going to specifically choose this type of character to ask it what it is. So it's like I'm pointing in a direction and the cast node is identifying exactly what I'm pointing at. So this is a vague node. It's not a hard reference. this is a cast a character, which further defines what my vague node is giving back. So you need to get used to casting to gather the information that you need to drive certain actions. In this case here, I'm going to cast my owner. I'm going to save it as a variable locally. So if you see under my variables tab here, I've got my character as a variable. So you remember variables are little chunks of information I can store, change, read. In this case, I'm only ever going to be reading from this because I don't need to change who owns me. It wouldn't make sense for that to happen anyway. So I'm storing this as my information. And furthermore, I'm asking that character what its character movement component is, and I'm storing that as a variable too. So in my references here, I've got character and movement component. So these two little variables here are just pieces of information that are relevant to what I'm trying to do, so that in the future I can point directly to this and say, hey, what is your speed? Are you airborne or not? What is your skeletal mesh? Otherwise, I would have to get my owner and cast to character every single time I wanted to check something on that character. So once this is done, I got my character and I have my movement component. Down here, the update animation event, you'll notice fires off every single tick. So the first thing it does when it fires is it gets the character. So it's equivalent to doing this. And you'll notice that this node here has a is valid and is not valid output. So this is called a validated get. So if I right click on my character variable and go down to convert to validated get, that's how I get this node. So this is a safety net. It's basically saying, as long as this character is valid, do the logic. But if for some reason I did this process here and it didn't give me anything useful, technically the variable in my animation blueprint would be empty. So if you see when I select my character variable, the default value is none. So until my animation blueprint initializes and actually sets this as my owning character, the default value of this variable is none. So if for some reason this breaks, I'm not going to let any logic come out here and work, because that's going to give me errors and potentially crashes and stuff. So this is a safety net to say, only do the logic following this node if this is a valid character for me to do the logic with. So validated gets are very useful. Get used to using them. You want to make sure in as many places as you can to not be able to break your logic. So it's safe. I could technically just leave it like this and it'd be fine, because there's nothing that's preventing me from doing this when the animation blueprint initializes. But there are ways or events where you might need to make sure that you have the proper variable. So next is a sequence node. This is a flow control node like a branch, but instead of a true and false output, it's got a then output. So it will input one event and then output at 0, then output at 1, then output at 2, and so on. So you can add as many as you want. And it's basically a way to make a list of things that happen in order. So if you right click, you can remove the pin that you've added. But so in this case here, my output goes through, I enter my sequence, the 0 happens first. So they've added some nice comments here. This comment box says, set velocity and ground speed from the movement component velocity. Ground speed is calculated from only the X and Y, so moving up or down does not affect it. What this means is I'm getting my character movement component, which I had set up here. I'm going to ask that component what my velocity is. So how fast am I moving through world space? I'm going to store that as a variable. And there's a function here that they use called vector length xy. And this is going to get the length of that vector in only the X and Y position. So the up and down is Z. They ignore that completely. And a vector length is basically saying how much am I moving in one frame. And that's going to tell me my current ground speed. So if I click and drag and type print and then plug my ground speed into this, you'll see what it's going to spit out. So when I'm not moving, it's 0. I start moving, 500. So this is a great way, and you notice when I jump, it's nothing. But if I'm jetpack flying, you'll see I still have my speed. So this is a great way to get the speed. Another way you could achieve this though, if you didn't want to use the vector length, is you can actually break this. This is actually, it's probably a little bit more complicated, but it's another way you can do it. I drag off, make this. So make vector. So what this does is a vector is just a 3 float variable, x, y, z, so 3 numbers. I can break it down into its individual number, so x and y and z, and I can make that number back into a vector. So you see a yellow input is vector, green is float. I can turn a yellow to a green, and because a vector is 3 greens, you'll see it's got 3 outputs. And then I could just add the x and the y together, but leave the z 0. And then if I type in length, this is going to spit out exactly the same number if I were to print string that. So you see I'm still getting 500. So this long, or this annoying process is the same thing as this. So I could delete that, right click to recombine, put it through this, and I'm getting exactly the same result. So this is how I'm getting my speed. If I wanted to in the future to add a animation layer on the jetpack itself for an up and down, I could just break this open again, grab the Z only, and save that as a variable called up and down speed, for example. The next thing is set should move to true only if ground speed is above a small threshold to prevent incredibly small velocities from triggering animations. So this is a safety net again. So if my current acceleration is, does not equal 0. So if this is a number that's not 0, it means my acceleration is actually something. And if my ground speed is greater than 3, so my ground speed here, if these are both true, I should move. So judging by the comment here, this was just a way to make sure that even if the slightest movement is on the character, I'm only going to start playing a move animation if it's past a certain threshold. So it's maybe not necessary for this case, but it's, again, good to have these safety nets because you want to make sure that things are behaving the way you expect it to. Because for some reason, you could have a very small acceleration. Maybe your character's sliding on something. You don't notice it, but your character could start running because the acceleration is technically slightly true. So that's interesting. Maybe not relevant to what we're doing. And then over here we have set is falling from the movement component. So they actually did what we did, but in the animation blueprint instead of the character blueprint. So we built this, actually no, we didn't save that as a variable. So right here, so is falling, we did not save this as a variable for us to use, but in the animation blueprint here, they had already done that. So in here, we know if we're falling, which is how they play the animation of the character falling. So this is all good stuff. If I go into the animation graph, I did that by double clicking on anim graph here. You'll notice my setup, or the setup of the default character. We have the output pose. This is the final result of what we see on the character, and you'll see that in the top left window here. We've got a control rig node, which we don't need to know. This is for animating your character or adjusting it at runtime. You've got a slot, which is a way to play a full body animation and force it on the character. Again, we don't need to know these right now. And then you have a state machine. So a state machine is where we choose the final animation to play, or we choose the pose to output from this state machine. So if I double click on this and go inside, you'll see I have my entry point here. When I enter this state, what is the first thing that plays? My locomotion. And then based on certain conditions, we have a bunch of things that can happen. So to show you this, if I have this open and click play, like in our character blueprint, we can actually, in the dropdown here, select our character. and see it happening in real time. So if I go back here and click jump, you'll see it go through each of the different states it needs to play the proper animation. So by default, when I enter the state, I'm in the locomotion. And if I double click on that, you'll see it's using a cached pose. A cached pose is a way for me to store the final pose of a state. So if I go up here, you'll see my final pose of this state is coming out through here, and that goes through this and this, and the final result is the output. In fact, I'm going to delete these to avoid confusion. We don't need those right now. So if I plug that in, compile and save, you'll see I have the same results. So the final output of this state is played here. In my state, in the locomotion state machine, you'll see I had my cached pose locomotion. If I go back to the top, I have a separate state called locomotion, and it's plugged into a cache pose node. So a cache pose is a way for me to store the pose of this state, and I can use it in any number of places as long as I call this function here. So if I copy this and go back to the top and paste it, I'm going to have the same results. Oh, I should have done that. I was still playing. So I put my cache pose there, and I have the same result of me running around. The only thing is, if I click jump, there's no jump animation. That's because I'm not going through my main states like I was before. I'm using the cache pose of my base locomotion. So it's just going from the output here, caching itself, and I'm calling that cache over here, and that's the final result. So they, in their default project, they've got the locomotion, they have a jump animation, and they have a falling loop. And then they have a land animation. So their locomotion was cached, but everything else is a flat animation. So my land animation is there, my jump animation is here, and my falling loop is here. We don't really need to go over too much of that. I'm not entirely sure why they only cached the base locomotion and nothing else. I like to cache every single unique state that the character can be in. So I would do something like right click and add a states. And I would call this airborne, for example. And I would cache this. And I would call this my airborne. Oh, if I were to spell properly. So I would put all my major states here, and my main states state machine would just direct from one cached pose to another. But anyway, it's how they had set it up here. But what we can do is make a Jetpack state. And I'll call this Jetpack. And for now, oh, okay, let me spell that properly finally. So Jetpack, and for now I'm just going to go make a random animation for me to know that my Jetpack is playing properly. So a quick way to do this would be to open up my Manny character. I'm going to grab his idle. I'm going to right click and duplicate this and call this my Jetpack idle. And then in my Jetpack state, I'm going to go inside, open up my content drawer, click and drag that, and you see it made me a blend tree. And if I go inside here, this is my Jetpack idle. So the first thing I'm going to do is make it looping, so that when I get to this animation here and it plays all the way through, it will loop again. So I'm going to go back to the very top, and if I compile, you'll see now everything is fine. So again, I've got my cached locomotion. This is the ground moving around. I've created a new state machine that contains my Jetpack animation, or it will. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that this animation here looks like a Jetpack. So I'm just going to open this up, and there's a very quick and dirty way to add or modify poses in animations. So the first step of making a feature is prototyping it and building the functionality. So I'm just going to make a rough animation. I don't care really how it looks. I just want to make sure it looks different. So if I grab the upper arm L, I'm just gonna, okay, let me put that up there and like that. So with those two selected, I've added a rotation. And because the pose is different now, you'll see this button here is active. So if I click key, now I've got a layer track on my animation. And if I click play, you'll see it's going through. So I'm going to do the same thing for my right. Put that up. And then key. And I'm just going to put the legs together so that it looks like the character is in the air. So that, key. And that, key. All right, so that's my Jetpack idle. So now if I go and open this up, you'll see this is my Jetpack thing. So I'm gonna go back and actually just to test, where am I? I'm gonna right click and type in Jetpack, and that's gonna give me my cache pose Jetpack. Plug that in there, compile and save, and now this is my character. So if I click play, you'll notice my character is using it. I can still move around because the character doesn't care what animation is playing, it's just cosmetic. But this is what I'm expecting to see when I'm actually using my Jetpack properly. So the next thing I want to do is on my top layer, and this is something you can put wherever you need to, wherever it makes sense. I'm just going to put it at the very top. I'm going to drag off my main stances and type blend by bool. So this node here will allow me to blend between two output poses. So I'm going to type my Jetpack and get my cached pose. And put that in the true and that in the false. And finally, I'm going to drag off of here and type, sorry, I'll redo that so you can see what I'm doing. I'm actually making a variable from the animation graph, or from the graph in general. So the way I had done it before was in the variables tab, I click plus and add a new variable and set it from there. But in a case like this, I can actually just drag off of here. And if you release, you see you have the promote to variable option. I'm going to click that and I'm going to type as Jetpack. And now I've created my own variable from here. And it will always use the variable type that you've dragged off of. So in this case, it gave me a Boolean. If I were to click and drag off here, call it whatever, you notice it's a float by default. So this is another quick way to generate your variables as you need them. So what this is going to do now is, if isJetpack is true, it's going to go through the Jetpack cache pose, which will be coming from my Jetpack state machine. If it's false, it's going to use the main states, which if I'm running around will go through locomotion, which will be using the locomotion cache pose. So the next thing I need to do is drive isJetpack. And we're going to do that in the next video. So now that we have the states built in the animation blueprint, I'm going to show you how to take information from the character, in this case the isJetpack Boolean that we made, and tell the animation blueprint what that variable is set to. So I'm going to go back into the event graph of the animation blueprint. And because they had already done this setup here where they can reference the character, all I need to do is add a new pin here. I'm going to click and drag my character variable. So I'm asking my owner information. And in this case, if I click and drag off of that, type isJetpack, if that's what I called it, let me double check. isJetpack, yes. So that should be the name. So go here, isJetpack. Oh, what did they do? Okay, perfect. So this is a good example of how casting works. So I'm getting my owner and I'm casting a character. But if you notice, my actual gameplay character is called third person character. But if I click on it and open it up, in the top right, you see I've got parent class. Parent class is character. So in fact, my animation blueprint is saying get my owner and get its root class, which is character. And in this class, I've got all the information I need. So by default, a character comes with all this information here, but I'm working in third person character. And in third person character, I've added my own information. So is jetpack, total duration, current duration. So in this case here, my owning actor, the casted character will not have this information because I've added it to a child of my character. I can't read a child from a parent, but I can read a parent from a child. I'll show you how that's done. So what I want to do is click and drag off my owning actor, and I can cast to third person character. And if I go over here and store that as a variable, I can call that third person character. And I will, for cleanliness, move that up to references. And now if I compile and go down here, instead of get character, I'm going to get third person character. And if I type in is jetpack, you'll see I now have access to my variables, jetpack, because that's the category that I added. And now I have access to read and write what my is jetpack boolean is set to. So the cool thing is, I also have off of here access to everything that character has access to, because my child's character, third person character, inherits all of the things that its parent has and then adds whatever modifications you make to it, which is why on my third person I have access to is jetpack, but on the base character I don't. So this is the parent, this is the child. It's only in the child that I added this boolean. So I would, after the fact, go ahead and clean this up by removing my reference, my cast2 character, and instead set it a cast2 my third person character specifically, but it's not a big deal in this case. So that's the next step after the feature is built, is I would go through my blueprints and clean things like this up. So I've got my is jetpack. And because I had created my bool earlier, so if I go back to my animation graph here, I had dragged off of and set as variable my boolean. I call it is jetpack. So I'm going to go to my event graph and I'm going to grab this and set it. And then out of my new sequence pin, I'm going to grab that. And then I'm going to do this. So now what this is going to do is every single tick, it's going to check is my character valid, go through all the processes of figuring out what my variables are, and eventually go through here and say, hey, owner, what is your is jetpack boolean set to? I want to have it set to that as well. So now if I go and click play, when I start flying, you see, I've got my animation. But if my character falls or touches the ground, well, as long as my is jetpack is true based on the logic I set up in my character here. So as long as this is set to true and false, as it should be, my animation blueprint will be up to speed as well. And now I'm just going to play that animation as needed. So I can add layers to this and have a blend space that will adjust the animations at runtime based on how fast forward, left, right, whatever. But these videos are already getting long, so I'm gonna do one more quick thing. I'm gonna add a character, a jetpack on the back of this character so we can see one more visual cue that the jetpack is actually active. So a quick way to do that, again, this is rough, we're prototyping so we can see the feature. So I'm going to select the skeletal mesh of the character. I'm going to add a component and type in cube. So this is going to give me just a generic gray box cube. But because I added it underneath the character, it's a child of that component. So one thing I can do of a child of a component is, with the cube selected, I've got a sockets tab. If I click this button here, it will give me a list of every joint on my character because it knows its owner is a character. And I'm going to take spine 4. Select that, and I'm going to scale my cube down. I'm going to turn off snapping so that it can be adjusted better. And I'm just going to move it roughly where the jetpack should be. And the next thing I want to do is make sure that with my cube selected, all of its collisions are turned off. I don't want anything colliding with this. It's visual only. compile and save. So now if I click play, I've got a little box here, and if I fly, it's there. The next thing I'm going to do is duplicate this. And I'm going to move this duplicate down slightly. Where did it go? Here. So I'm going to set all of its values to 0. And I'm also going to make this a child of spine 4. Move it back. I'm going to scale this down a little bit. And then finally, I'm going to call this my Jetpack trail. And then the main cube, I'll call it Jetpack, just for clarity. So those two things done, I want to turn this cube red when my Jetpack is active, just so that we can visually see that it's active other than the animation. So we're going to do it this way, but eventually if you have VFX or something, you can trigger it the same way. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to take my Jetpack trail. I'm going to get a reference to it. And because this component is a static mesh, you see if I mouse over it in brackets, static mesh component, if I drag off of the variable when it's in the graph, I have static mesh specific functionalities. So in this case, I'm going to type in material, and it gives me a set material option. So I'm going to do that. And if I click and drag and add this to my line of logic here, so all these things happen when my Jetpack is active. And then I'm going to copy paste these two here. And I'm going to move everything over. And plug that into there. So by default, if I select that Jetpack trail, you'll see the material is basic shape material. I can either click in the dropdown and type in basic shape. I may not even have access to it through here because it is a basic thing. So I can also just click on find in content browser. So it's right there. With it selected in my content browser, if I click this little arrow, I can plug it in there. So this node here will set it back to basic shape when I stop my Jetpack. And this node here, I'm going to see what do we have available to us. There we go. Basic asset red. Compile and save. And now if I go and click play, when I'm flying, because it was the first time I was using that, that material, it had to compile, but now it should be good. So now it turns red when my Jetpack is active. So the next steps would be to go in and figure out how we can improve this. Does it feel good? If it is a production, you would talk to the designers and see if they're happy with the results. I would definitely go in and clean up a lot of this stuff. Like I said, the third person character should be the reference, not the parent class of character. I would comment this a bit more. Maybe even move this functionality here to a custom event. So keep it in a self-contained graph. So we can clean this up a bit, but this is all the next steps. What's important is that we're building the feature and we're happy with it, and we're anticipating issues in the future and already working to solve those issues. So that was essentially, I'd say like 80% of all you need to know to get your features out the door and start exploring and experimenting inside of the engine. Nothing I did was too complex. It's just a bunch of small, easy to use features and nodes used in the right combination to achieve the result, right? So keep breaking things. If you have ideas, it's not hard to test them. Just, I would recommend going through the process of breaking it down in Notepad, explore the engine, right click on the graph, see all the contextual nodes, play around with them, but that's essentially it. There's nothing too complex about it, right? So good luck.